Greetings.
Should I put a little more growl into it?
Okay, I came back to, we spent 48 hours making puppets.
Making and breaking hearts, Ellinger.
It's not that kind of podcast.
On a practical level, I have to remember what I was saying on a practical level.
We should have a safe word. Armageddon!
I guess we're maybe semi-proud of that.
Welcome to Hide and Create, your online writing workshop.
Welcome back to Hide and Create, your online writing workshop. I'm Moses Siregar, on the line with Joshua Essoe, Jordan Ellinger, and our Southern Belle, Diana Rowland.
That's a new word.
Today we're going to talk about writing big, scary monsters. And I'm going to go right to our editor, Joshua Essoe, for opening thoughts.
Bam! Okay. The first thing I want to point out is that a monster doesn't necessarily have to have fangs and claws and go rawr. For example, is Dexter a monster? Snape? How about Agent Smith from The Matrix, or the Red Queen from Resident Evil? Or the Joshua supercomputer from War Games, or Mr. Joshua from Lethal Weapon. So monsters can take all different shapes and forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be just a big beastie.
Jordan, I know you had an angle you wanted to tackle on this subject, so go ahead with that.
Sure. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the uncanny valley right now. And what that is if there's a graph of, say, cuteness in characters, right, from iconic characters, like a stick figure, to hyper-real characters like a Robert Bateman painting, right? People accept and love more detail in a character as in terms of a graph that looks up. It looks like a hill that climbs up the hill towards hyper-realistic characters, and people really like hyper-realistic characters, and they really identify with them. But there is a valley right before hyper-realistic characters, which is basically a Robert Zemeckis movie. So, like Mars Needs Moms, or what is that? The Polar Express. Right, those characters are very subtly different from humans, right? Like their eyes don't move correctly.
They're creepy.
Yeah,
creepy.
They're creepy, right? And so that's an uncanny valley of acceptance, right? So the graph looks like a hill, except with a giant valley right before you get to hyper-realistic. Right?
So like those ghosts and monsters that they have, like in Silent Hill, for example.
Yeah. Where
they're distorted human shapes. Or they will have like enormous mouths full of teeth, or they'll move very sharply, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Like I watched a movie called The End of the Line, and it was a low-budget horror, and the director achieved a very scary monster just by putting pantyhose over an actor's head and coloring it in so it looked like their eyes were blurred. Okay, all you have to do to achieve a scary monster is make something that's very close to human, but that differs in very subtle ways, right? So if you can paint that image in a reader's mind, there's something in the mechanics of our brain. Like our brain is very good at recognizing faces, right? And so when it sees something that's very close to human, it tries to recognize that face, the brain mechanics that it tries to recognize that face, but it's subtly different. So your brain tells you it's wrong and scary.
That's
right?
Awesome. That's a great point.
Yeah. So you can take advantage of that even when it's a mental image, right, in a reader's mind. So you can create a scary monster just by making one quality or something very different, so it's not quite human.
Nice. Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that I thought about as we're getting into this topic is we're not filming a movie. In a movie, you can create your CGI monster, and it can be like as you write fiction though. I mean, you're trying to write a monster, and how do you make that compelling or scary or interesting or I don't know. Go ahead, Diana, if you have any thoughts on this, because I think it's a challenge.
I do have thoughts, and I think it's more that it's not so much what the monster looks like, although that is a good aspect of it. This ties into my old thing about the evil character who is evil because they're evil. Okay, monsters are not so much the evil character, but they're the character that scares us. And a monster, whether it is a furry creature with claws or a human that looks just like you and me, the monster is something that assaults our sensibilities and offends our sense of peace and drives us to fear for our own safety or the safety of our loved ones, whether that safety is physical, emotional, or mental. So, Ted Bundy was a monster, okay? We've all seen in the news of very human monsters, and then when you look at the more successful monsters in media, whether it's film or books. Okay, I'm going to go back to Buffy. I think Buffy has a lot of good examples. One of the scariest monsters in that is the gentleman from the episode where they're all silent.
Totally.
They are so scary because this ties in a bit with what Jordan was saying, where they're very similar to human, but they're a little different. They have that wide grin, and they just kind of float and with creepy, and everything about them is creepy.
They move, right? Their movement is so smooth and flowing and slow.
And it's not natural. And so, make that twist of not natural, not right. Even a human monster, a human non-paranormal monster like Ted Bundy, what he does is not natural. Serial killers. So you look at a monster as something that's not natural. And I think that's the twist you have to make. And it doesn't have to be in appearance. It can be in movement, like you said, or sound or something. It's not natural. And it makes you fear. And it generates that fear for yourself by what they convey. The silence, I think, is a good example in Doctor Who, where it's not so much that what they look like is scary. It's the fact that when you look away, you forget them. And that concept is scary. It's like, oh my God, there's this monster all around me, and I don't even know it.
If you want an example, because we're not shooting a movie, Moses was saying, an example of that exact mechanic in fiction is Stephen King's The Walking Dude, right? Like he has a very scary, and he appears again in the Gunslinger
Everything.
series. Yeah. And he has a very scary laugh, right? And it's not quite a human laugh, right? And that is the creepiest thing about him. And Stephen King does this very, very well in fiction, right? So you can tell he's definitely a monster because of the things that he does, like the laugh, that aren't quite human. So you recognize it as a human thing, but he portrays it as not being quite human, and that makes him even more terrifying.
Okay, taking notes. Stephen King is a good horror writer.
Yeah, I think he'll make waves. I think you'll hear about him in the next couple of years. So that kid's got something.
I think about the one way to try to make the monster scary, because again, fiction. How do you do this when you're writing fiction? Is you have your characters' reactions to the monsters. You show their feelings as they're around the creature, or you show how does everyone, how does life change because of the monster? How does everyone around the monster act? A lot of it is showing the people who are having to deal with the monster, right? How else can you kind of work on evoking the sense of something fearful or awesome or terrifying, or how do you get that emotion through in fiction?
By keeping the monster hidden.
Well, that's one way.
Yeah,
don't show it right away.
One way is the reader's imagination is more scary to them than you could ever be, right? Because everybody has different fears. Everybody has different triggers, and as an author, you can't necessarily hit all of the triggers, so you can let the reader hit them themselves, right? By keeping the monster hidden, and then they imagine whatever it is that's scary to them. If they're scared of snakes, then this hidden monster assumes snake-like characteristics, right? As long as you keep it hidden. When you finally reveal the monster, then you reveal that it's not snake-like, and it can be a little bit of a disappointment to readers unless they're already really invested in the projection character, which we talked about earlier. But let the reader do the work of scaring themselves for you.
Well, it's almost like a projection monster.
Sure, yeah,
right?
projection monster.
Yeah, that reminds me of the Reavers in Firefly. You see how scared they are of these Reavers.
And you really, you never see the Reavers. You see the results. You see how people change in response to the monster, and you see how people close to the characters are changed. The good episode is speaking of Reavers, is the one where the guy was on the ship with the Reavers and he basically becomes a Reaver. And that makes the Reavers even more scary. It's like, wow, they have this much effect that it affected this guy that much.
And they still didn't show the Reavers.
They never show the Reavers. I don't think they ever show them until the movie, right? And
Not
even then, they don't really show them. They show their bodies. That's about it. But
no, they do it. The last battle, don't they?
Yeah,
it's a huge battle.
Yeah, that's about it. but yeah, they're great because I mean I even have notes written down here about the way to convey the fear is well, you go back to our previous episode about emotional response. You can tap into that, but show that okay, your neighbor had an encounter with the monster, and he suddenly became bitter and mean, and started being mean to the kids, and started being like a terrible person, and that's scary because he used to be a really nice guy, and suddenly that old nice guy is gone.
Yeah, you mentioned the Reavers in Firefly. The another good example of how keeping things scary with by keeping them hidden is Steven Spielberg's first film, Duel. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. It's basically a guy's traveling across the country, and he upsets a trucker, and the trucker then comes after him, right? and you never see the trucker in the entire movie. You never see him, right? I think the closest you get, he gets out of his semi truck once, and he's in shadow, right, under a ball cap, right? And that was a very deliberate choice, and it made it. I mean, you're just not scared of a trucker, because it's a trucker, but you can be afraid
by not seeing him. He becomes a monster and not just a mean trucker. Exactly. And then your statement about cueing readers in how to respond was excellent, and I think that kind of riffed off what Joshua was saying last week about emotional resonance. You can have third parties cue the reader. This is what you should be feeling. This character whom you love, and maybe they're even a very brave character, is afraid. So you should be afraid at this point.
What about monsters? We're talking about monsters who remain hidden and using that as a technique to generate that sort of fear in the reader. What about monsters that are visible? How do you handle that? Can you have the monster, visible and work well and still create that kind of fear?
Okay,
yes.
I'm going to use... Yeah, I'd like to use natural disaster as just an analogy, basically. Okay, like Hurricane Katrina, that was, people call it a monster storm. I mean, it was monstrous in its devastation, what it did, and going back to how it changed people. Everyone changed. It changed the city. It changed the landscape. It changed people. People, with PTSD, people reacted differently. There are people now who... We used to think hurricanes were fun. When I was growing up, hurricanes were fun. Hurricanes were one of these things you got a couple of days off school if it was during the school year. Or, you just holed up and you had some water and lamps and stuff and they were fun. But after Katrina, it's like, oh, God, no, this isn't fun anymore. We'll evacuate for the Category 1s now. And it changed the way everybody looked at that sort of thing. And the other metaphor I was going to use, or analogy, is miscarriage. Once you've had a miscarriage, it steals the joy of pregnancy. Even if you get pregnant again, you're afraid. You're afraid that whole pregnancy that it's going to happen again, that you're going to lose this child too, that you're going to experience that grief and loss again. And so the lingering effect of that monster of miscarriage is how it changes you. Every little twinge, you're nervous. You go to see the doctor more often. You get more tests because it's changed you. And so I think that you can show your monster, but you still have to show how it changes people.
That's interesting. Interesting and creative use of monster, because now we're talking about natural disasters as monsters and inner monsters, right? Those are great. I think a key to making a good scary monster is also maintaining your reader's suspension of disbelief. It's rather critical in horror fiction. So the other side of the coin of what we were just talking about is your monster has to be as real as possible. They should have backstories and histories, even if you're the only one who knows them, and that stuff doesn't actually make it into the story that you're writing. Know what motivates your monster. Why does it want the things that it wants? Why does it do the terrible things that it does? Did it have a difficult childhood? Was it an orphan and taught no social skills or raised by wolves? Right?
Was it just born monstrous?
Or was it just born monstrous? But even if it's born monstrous, it can't just be a one-dimensional monster, because that's totally boring.
Oh, really?
The point is that...
Not necessarily if the monster's victims are not one-dimensional, right? Like, you can have... like pursuit monsters. Like a zombie is, by definition, quite boring, right? It's just a zombie.
Even the Reavers, they do all these terrible things, but they don't really have deeper motivations.
Yeah, exactly. You get that fear from the complexity. You have to, in order to have a big scary monster, you have to have a protagonist people care about, because if you know, I mean, everybody's seen a horror movie with, you know, 5 teenagers slowly getting killed off, and you don't care about the teenagers, right? So it's just not scary anymore.
Because you're too stupid to live, blah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? You know, like that when you get scared is when you have protagonists that you care about that are in danger, right? That's something that Stephen King did well, and all of his imitators kind of forgot about, right?
Yeah.
Stephen King,
all of his
characters are really well realized, and you do care about them quite a lot, and so you get terrified when they're put in danger.
Yeah, the knowing the monster and having the history, that's for a very specific kind of monster, obviously. It doesn't work for everything. But it is a key to making that particular kind of monster work. And like what you said, in Counterpoint, you got to make your readers really believe in and feel for your viewpoint character, because you want them to feel every drop of horror and pain and revulsion that character does about your monster.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Moses, you were saying something?
Yeah, so I'm still kind of, you know, I'm still mulling over this question of, you know, you've got like your terrifying monster. We talked about keeping them kind of off stage, and you show the characters' fear of that monster and the reactions and how they change their lives and things like that. You know, to what extent can you put that big scary monster, you know, visible on the screen, and how does that work? Like, if you had the Reavers, and we saw the Reavers in episode 3 of Firefly, or maybe we saw them from the point of view of like a ship, and they invade the ship and they start raping and killing everyone. You know, what would that have done to the story to see them more clearly? It would have killed the anticipation, you know, like, oh my God, what are these things? Like,
it would just change the flavor of it, I think. I don't think it would change the horror of it. I mean, because you look at zombie movies, we see the zombies, but yet we still have that horror of the inexorable, I can never say that word, that nonstop progress that won't stop. And, you know, no matter which zombie type of thing you're looking at, whether it's a George Romero or Zombieland or, you know, whatever metaphor it's supposed to be, the idea is that it's something that is just implacable and you can't stop and all this other stuff. So you see the zombies, but you can still be afraid of them, and you can still sense the horror and the, oh my God, what if it happens to me? I'll become that, and that sort of thing. So it would just change the flavor. I don't think it would change the fact that they are monsters.
If you're using a more transparent monster, make sure that you know the rules for your monster and you keep your monster consistent. Nothing will drive your readers more batty if, for example, you have zombies die in the beginning of your story with a shovel to the back of the head, and somehow towards the end of the movie they become immune to that and start needing to be shot in the left eye with a desert eagle and then decapitated and set on fire to keep them from standing back up.
Unless there's a really good reason for it.
Unless it's set up and it's like the monster boss zombie.
Yeah.
So if you break consistency with your monster rules, you break your reader's suspension of disbelief. So have a really good reason and set that up if you're going to do it.
What I wanted to say about zombies in particular, not to bring it back, I mean, that's a very valid point, Joshua, is that what zombies do is they embody a very primal fear. Everybody has dreams about being chased, right? And you can get into the psychology of that later on, right? But people do have that fear. So what zombies do is they personify that fear into a monster shape, something that chases you and can never be defeated. Right?
Yeah.
If you look at other successful movies, but the Blair Witch Project is the fear of, you know, when you're camping, just on the other side of a very thin sheet of canvas, there could be anything: a bear, a monster, whatever. I mean, there's a fear of camping that everybody kind of secretly feels like they don't know what's on the other side of that canvas, right? What was that? Movie, it was the handheld movie. It was very cheaply made.
And it wasn't Blair Witch?
No, it was
Paranormal Activity?
Thank you. Paranormal Activity is what it was. That's the fear of sleeping, right? When we're asleep, virtually anything could be happening in our actual bedroom. There could be monsters walking around in our actual bedroom.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'm never going to be able to sleep.
That's why you eat spiders.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I mean, so that's monsters. Often when I try to think of a new monster, I try to think of what is a place where you're extremely vulnerable, that maybe people don't realize how vulnerable you are.
Clowns in the closet.
Well,
in the closet.
Gee, thanks.
That goes back to the sleeping thing, right? But yeah, I mean, and then you can create a monster around that vulnerability, right? Or that kind of primal fear that everybody has, right? And then it doesn't really even matter what they look like if you can make the monster look like something that's ironic to the theme, that contributes to the theme, or it's ironic or whatever, that's even better, right? But you can make, virtually any style monster as long as you take advantage of that primal fear.
Yeah, and going back to what you said about zombies, see that right there?
That was clever.
Thank you. Another thing you said about chasing, and that's very, very valid. And the other thing that zombies do, I think, and this is the key thing for me, is that zombies really engage that fear of betrayal by everyone that you know.
That's a good point.
Your loved ones aren't your loved ones anymore. Instead of, being your caring support system, they're now trying to eat your face.
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of primal, I think. So that's one of my reasons. That's one of the reasons I think that zombies are my favorite type of horror, because it really engages me personally.
Fear of getting eaten alive, yeah, for sure. That's primal.
But by like your wife and your mom and your brother,
and not in a good way.
And not in a good way. Yeah.
Is there a good way?
Well, I was kind of going with the wife part, not the mom and brother part.
Ah, got it.
Might want to
Yeah,
cut that
the
out.
family thing was a little bit weird. Yeah.
Well, you are, Southern, so.
Wow, I was thinking that, but I was like, I'm not going there.
Sort of our Paula Deen sort of figure.
Yeah. Should we have closing thoughts?
So just a few thoughts before we go to closing thoughts.
I have one thought before closing thought, just so you know.
Okay, forget what I just said and talk.
Okay. Make your setting as believable and realistic as possible. Because if your readers can believe in your fictional world, then they can believe in your fictional monster. Help your readers believe your horror, your monster, your fear by aiding them in suspending their disbelief. I've been talking a lot about suspending their disbelief because I think it's super important. Try not to violate the rules of impossibilities. That's a rule that David Farland teaches that essentially says that the more fantastic ideas you ask your readers to accept and to imagine, the harder that they have to work, and the less they're likely to not only believe but to reject the story in the first place. So your setting can play a big, strong role in supporting your monster. And monster support is important. I mean, don't invalidate that.
So, I just have a few thoughts before we go to final thoughts. I'm thinking back again to those Reavers, and what if they had shown the Reavers early, and you didn't have that fear of anticipation? I do think it seems like it wouldn't have been quite as effective because there is a hook where you're going to see these things eventually. You're scared to see these things eventually. You explore the fears the characters have of the Reavers, and so eventually you're going to see them. But I think with horror, it probably is a really good technique to keep that hook in the reader to see, oh my God, what is this thing going to be like? What's it going to do?
Yeah, it's almost like Joss Whedon really knows what he's doing, man.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. But I also have a thought about the visible monster. A lot of times your visible monster is a character who is charismatic. It's a villain. It's someone who is interesting. So when you see Freddy Krueger or the Joker or one of these guys that are visible, it's because like they're compelling and interesting and cool, like in and of themselves. A lot of times, I think it's probably challenging to have the visible monster that's just sort of the scary monstrosity, one-dimensional blah kind of thing. That if you're going to show that, like I think that's probably challenging to show that early. Like you maybe either want to keep it hidden or you want to have the monster be fascinating in and of itself, or else you got to figure out something brilliant to do with it if you're going to make it visible earlier. So I don't know. I'm still thinking these things through. But let's go to the closing thoughts, and I will go to Diana.
Okay, I was just actually going to riff on what you just said about the appealing monster. I really like that. The Joker and the ones that are charismatic, that you do have a bit of an affinity, not affinity, but you're interested in, and you are drawn to them, and that makes them even more horrific because you shouldn't be. You know that they're bad, they do terrible things. At the same time, you kind of not really like them, but you kind of get them a little bit, and you're drawn to them, and you want to find out more about them. And so, yeah, I think that makes it really interesting. My big thing is if the monsters, whether they're visible or not visible, if the monsters don't affect your characters' lives, then they're not very monstrous. They need to generate some change in behavior or attitude or anything, and that's what That's what your readers want to see. They want to see how will your characters react and deal with these monsters and the changes in their lives.
Nice. And Joshua?
I want to talk about inspiration for a sec. So, inspiration and references abound for info on the history for, let's say, mythology and all manner of different awesome monsters. There are sections in, I think it was Our Universe, that postulate on alien life forms. Those can be great for monsters. D&D manuals, the Warhammer 40K rulebooks have a lot of stuff that you could use for inspiration. Sometimes you can get really fantastic ideas for monsters by looking at a set of Illustrator trading cards. I had a bunch of these when I was younger. I still do somewhere. But, like Frazetta, Boris, Bell, Royo, Rowena, Elmore, all these people have drawn and painted some amazing scenes, and a lot of them, most of them, don't have stories attached. Go look at those, get some inspiration, and or you could just look at bugs. You're like really, really close, because those are really scary.
And we'll finish with Jordan.
Great. I just want to take time to plug the anthology Dark Descent, which is an old anthology by David G. Hartwell, but it contains some really, really good horror short stories. And I'm going to come across as a Stephen King fanboy if I'm not already, but the two scariest short stories I've ever read are Monkey, which I think is what the movie Monkey Shiners is based on. It's incredibly well done short story, and the other one is his ode to Lovecraft called Crouch End. And Crouch End, Moses, has very visible monsters, some of which are in that uncanny valley, so it's another great depiction, literary depiction of the uncanny valley, but then it also has like full-on elder old ones in that as well, which are very well done. So read that anthology and those short stories in particular if you want a real primer on writing terrifying monsters.
Great. Well, now that we've scared the crap out of you, you guys can go off and write. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
This has been another episode of Hide and Create. The show is produced by me, Jordan Ellinger. The site is edited by Joshua Essoe, and your co-hosts have been Diana Rowland and Moses Siregar. That music that you're listening to was written by Jason Donnelly. We can be reached at writingpodcastonline.com, where you can ask us questions and suggest topics for future shows. Thank you for listening. Now go hide and create something.